Hello, welcome everyone. I hope you can all hear me, and I hope for anybody who's in person, thank you for coming, and for anyone who's at home, that you're home safe and cozy in today's weather. But today I want to introduce to you, we have an exciting topic where we'll be talking about invisible disabilities. And before I pass it on to our two amazing guests today, my friends and colleagues, I do want to first remind everybody that if you want to learn about Allied, our program, we do have a website called website that you can find. It's disabilityawareness.sites.northeastern.edu. You can follow us via social media. And you can always reach out to either me or Josh, the program manager. But without further ado, I want to pass this along to my amazing colleagues. We're going to first talk to Professor Chris Parsons about his story, and then we're going to pass it on to Professor Melissa Ferrick about her story. So thank you very much for being here today, and let's hear their stories and get your questions ready. Thank you.
I feel like I should be not saying, can everyone hear me out of the gates 2 years into using Zoom, but it's like, but can everyone hear me? Is everything okay? Yeah, perfect. I just want to thank Mona and the other organizers at Allied for inviting me and for creating this venue. This is a really great opportunity to get to know each other better. Yeah, to share some of my experiences with coming to terms with thinking of myself as disabled, which I think is a major part of the story here for me. I'll say that my experience with an invisible disability, in this case for me, it's obsessive compulsive disorder. It shows like a fundamental tension. On the one hand, I was hired, I'm an associate professor because of my mind. And the university celebrates supposedly the life of the mind. We are about shaping minds, forming minds, lifting minds up. And yet mine proves, let's say, slippery. Slippery is a good euphemism for what my brain is at times. It's unreliable. And on the one hand, there are things about my brain and the way that it works that have made me, I would say, thrive as a humanities professor. It turns out if your brain likes going down random obsessive tunnels of thought, that's a really great skill to have as a humanities professor. If, on the other hand, there are multiple days where you can't get out of a particular obsessive thought and the compulsions that go along with it, it can make it difficult to remain a functioning colleague, collaborator, and educator at the university. And so it, for me, has been, it's a love-hate relationship with my brain. I know a lot of us have these, but this is my story. I'm still reasonably new to coming to think about myself as having a disability. I think one of the tricky things about a lot of invisible disabilities, especially those that are related to the mind, they're easy to internalize. And on the one hand, that by their very nature, as invisible disabilities, is because the question of where, when, and to whom you disclose is open. And that is, in many cases, a real privilege. I can go into a room and no one will necessarily make assumptions about me. And this is especially true as a white man in academia with an invisible disability. And so there are, but at the same time, it's easy to, and the story of my relationship with my obsessive compulsive disorder is that it's easy to hide those things, but make them internal and see them as character flaws or something like this. And so part of the reason it may, like, there are strategic reasons to disclose or not, but a major facet for me has been the extent to which these things are in fact real, or they are, as I said, products of inherent defect in my personality or work ethic or these sorts of things, as opposed to brain chemistry or the shape of my brain or these sorts of things. There is, I think, still some tension in the study of these between looking for different brain structures, brain chemistry, and focusing on past experiences and the more kind of psychoanalytic approach. But it took me a long time to kind of come to terms and think of myself as disabled. And in many cases, I really went into that once I received tenure, when I knew that I had some flexibility and support to be able to say, I am disabled, and I want to make sure that if other people want to announce themselves as disabled, it's easier for them. So a lot of this comes to me with the question of disclosure. And as I said, it is a real privilege to be able to choose when and where and to whom you disclose. But for me, it has always been a tricky thing. The first thing with a lot of, and this is, so the average length of time, I read this in a study, to diagnosis with obsessive compulsive disorder is 17 years from the presentation of first symptoms, because it masquerades as so many other things, and it is colloquially referred to sometimes as the doubting disease. And so it can be really tricky to pin down. And so the decision to disclose is complicated by disclose about what. For a lot of my life, this has been a shifting target, and I, through various regimes of therapies, of treatments, have had a lot of different labels attached to my brain before finding this one for the past 5-6 years that has really fit and been a good treatment for me, or a good path for me, good to work with. It's a good sort of placeholder for a lot of the quirks that I experience, and a path towards treatments that have been really beneficial in my life. So even if I had wanted to disclose earlier, I'm not just sure how I would do it. And the thing about that I found showing up in higher education as well is that there is, let's be honest, an acceptance that we have an above average amount of quirks as a profession. And I think especially as a white male professor, there is an acceptance and even a expectation of being kind of an absent-minded, not entirely there. In many ways, I think the quirkier you act, the more the students think they're getting a real legitimate experience with a person who's so smart that they forgot to wear shoes that match, or those sorts of things. And so there's figuring out what is, for myself, what was a quirk, what was normal, what was worth putting myself out, and what was worth trying to seek extra help for, as opposed to, as I said, just seeing this as a internal defect. It was a little bit complicated for me as well, because I am now an American citizen, but at the beginning of the hiring process for me, I wasn't. And there remain parts of the citizenship process. I don't know how many of you have gone through the citizenship process, but it's kind of like this, they never really get rid of much. They just kind of add on new layers. So for example, the major disease they're worried about when you become a citizen is syphilis, because at one point syphilis was seen as a threat to the nation. So the disease that I got tested for was syphilis. I had to check a yes or no box about whether I had committed mass murder or genocide. There were these questions and parts of the citizenship process that got added for particular moments in American history and never really got cut out. And one of those has to do with mental fitness, because the world was in the early part of the 20th century and going forward, this idea of mental fitness as an effective test to bar people who might become dependents of the state. And so there still are questions and sorts of things that they try to ascertain about whether you've, for example, ever been in a mental hospital, the sorts of mental conditions you might have been treated for. And so there were, strategically to me as well, I made decisions about not disclosing that I was worried would keep me out of the country. I hadn't committed mass murder of genocide. I'd never been a communist. But I'd never been a terrorist. These were all yes, no boxes. But I was concerned about not being let in the country or not being allowed to stay on a permanent basis. And even just among my colleagues as well, there was a general hesitancy to disclose. I had a colleague say, "What would you hope to gain by disclosing?" or a sense that I didn't disclose and I had these issues, why should you? There was a general sense that there was nothing good that could come from it, and so I didn't. And that, I think, in many ways, held off this conversation of engaging more fully with whether this was a disability or not, and whether this was a series of quirks, a series of behaviors that I would have to deal with. Unfortunately, as someone with OCD, I would consider myself fairly high functioning, but it nonetheless remains that I just had to kind of white knuckle it through to tenure, which is not a strategy that I necessarily recommend to many in hindsight. And so I got tenure, and one of the first things I did, even as I was going through the tenure process, I started selectively reaching out within my field, and then within my department, and then within the university. And I am tremendously glad that I have, because I think there are questions that are particular to the way that my brain and body work, that are nonetheless entry points into broader conversations and broader community around the question of access, and the goal of creating universally accessible spaces, universally accessible programs and supports, and trying to figure out ways in which I can make it a little bit easier for people who are now just starting out, so that they know, for example, who anonymously they're able to speak to, what resources exist for support for people who are starting out. That was one of my big issues as well, is I wasn't sure to whom I could reach out for support without going to the same people who would make my tenure decisions. And so there have been real benefits. And the one thing I would say overwhelmingly is this sense of community. It turns out that there are a lot of people with invisible disabilities, even if I think the latest statistics suggest that 2% of faculty or something like this identify as disabled, when the broader population, it's around 20. And this has been really helpful. I've not actually needed accommodations for my obsessive compulsive disorder outside of, I will say that the COVID pandemic presented an issue when my brain was already trying to tell me that everything was poison, and was trying to kill me all the time. It was actually quite disorienting when, for the first time, I thought my brain might actually be right. But what I would say that I'm looking forward to is figuring out the sorts of support for where I want my career to go. So far, as I've said, I've been able to function quite well in the model of the academic who locks himself away with old documents and comes out with articles or books. And yet certain areas certain directions in which I'd like my career to go, there are issues of pedagogy, there are issues of administration that I would like to be able to be more involved in, and like to make a more central part of who I am as an academic. And right now, the idea of positions where I know that I can't, for lack of a better word, flake out for a couple days if my brain is not letting me participate in the world at large, that is daunting to me. And so beyond accommodation, I think what I hope to see are resources that can enable access to some of those sorts of positions with different types of responsibilities that in the past, at least, I've not been able to navigate on my own. I will just say as well that one of the real benefits for this has been my relationship with students. And in a lot of ways, I think my experience with undergraduate students has made me a lot braver about disclosure and figuring out what this means for who I am as a person and an academic. I have found year over year more students willing to talk about depression, anxiety, ADHD, all these acronyms that have become much more central to our experience of not just classroom management, but the classroom experience. And the ability to figure out where and when I can share my experience, and actually also learn from students who have figured out, I think, better ways than those of my generation of forming community around those acronyms. It has been just tremendously rewarding. I think this has been particularly important during the pandemic, where the level, I don't think anyone can deny that the dial on all of our anxieties, on the ways in which our brains trip us up, have been dialed up to a great degree. And so my ability to work with students and the relationships I've formed with students around issues of neurodiversity, accommodations, mental health, have just been tremendously rewarding. I think for me, as I said, it's made me braver and more committed to figuring out the landscape at Northeastern. And for them, I think seeing an ally who understands during all this that bodies and brains are I don't even want to say imperfect, but bodies and brain need to be taken into account in degrees in life, and especially during the moment we're going through. So it's still an ongoing process. This is, I think, one of the things with that because at various moments I feel that my OCD disables me, and at other points it doesn't. I think it will be an ongoing sort of roller coaster. But I'm, as I said, tremendously grateful for opportunities like this to talk these issues through and figure out how we can make Northeastern a more accessible and welcoming space for all of us with these sorts of acronyms and issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing it. Professor Melissa now.
Hi, everybody. How are you today? I first want to thank Mona for inviting me to speak. It's been lovely getting to know you, Mona, and also Chris, great to see you again. And I also want to thank Tom and Kara for interpreting today. I also feel a new kinship with you, Professor Parsons, because my middle name is Parsons. So there you go. I kind of just want to start by telling you that I'm nervous, and that speaking publicly about my invisible disabilities is nerve-wracking in front of my peers, not in front of students. So I really agree with Chris about the connection I have with my students around me. I have a mood disorder. I'm cyclothymic, which is a low level of a bipolar disorder. And this is found in highly creative people, which I am. So it certainly helps me with my work and with my thinking, which I'm sure I was hired for that, right? So, I mean, that works really well, but it is what it is. And it took a really, really long time to diagnose as well. So I went through a period of about 20 years being misdiagnosed and put on different medications. And it was extremely difficult. And it affected my work more so when I was out there as an artist, because I spent 25 years making records and touring. And that also didn't contribute to finding any sort of balance or well-being in that way. So I'm sure you can imagine the combination of, running all over the country and making records and being on different meds without any consistent community or medical care was really a recipe for disaster, So finally getting proper, in my opinion anyway, properly diagnosed and taken care of with a holistic approach that I take, which includes both Western and Eastern medicine, has been since, I don't know, I'd say like the past decade. So maybe 15 years. So that's really good. The other piece of a lived experience I have, I didn't realize was an invisible disability till recently, which is that I grew up in a active alcoholic home, and I am a member of long-term recovery in the community. So when I first came to Northeastern, this was something I talked a lot about when I was teaching at Berklee College of Music, sobriety, growing up in an addictive home, what it's like as an adult child of an alcoholic, how that affects me, the amount of PTSD I have around that, And students really, particularly artists, I mean, we know from research that artists are 4.5 times more likely to be alcoholic or to become addicts, and also to have come from homes with addiction. And I've had a lot of students who are dealing with parents or trusted adults who are in addiction, active addiction. A lot of times they're incarcerated for this addiction. And it's just something that really isn't talked about. So when I first came to Northeastern just 3 years ago, one of the first things I do whenever I arrive anywhere is I look for meetings of some kind. Predominantly for me, I look for 12-step meetings. And they're usually available. They're available everywhere you go. They're all over the world, but they're also usually available at institutions, at places that, they're at hospitals, they're at colleges, and there weren't any here. And that was really hard for me. That was hard because I wasn't going to meet anybody else that works here that might have grown up with an alcoholic dad or had a kid that was in recovery, or and so that's tough, because it's good to see a face when I'm walking across campus that I can just kind of wave at and be like, hey, to have kind of that knowingness between us. And I think for me, like with invisible disabilities, that's the thing that makes me feel comfortable. And that's the reason why I'm out about this, because I know that when I do talk about, having a mood disorder and being somebody who grew up in an unsafe environment and who now lives a life of sobriety and has for a long time, it's helpful when I see other people that have, similar or, other invisible disabilities. It just makes me feel less alone. And this feeling of aloneness is something that drives addiction. And it also can cause me, when I do feel alone, it can cause me to believe that I'm alone. And then that's a dangerous place for my mind to be, because it can push me into depression. And so we talk a lot in creativity. The intersection of psychopathology and creativity is really my main focus, and what I'm most interested in doing work in and on is this really this very narrow line between solitude and isolation that artists deal with. So it's really important for me to have solitude, to work in, to be quiet, to go into the room like Chris was talking about, and get down to work, get down to thinking, which I love to think. But for me, being alone thinking for too long is not a good idea. I can go into rumination. So it's really good for me to have community that they can kind of tap on my door and be like, come on out, let's get some dinner. But I think I don't really know what else to say about this. It is just I think the drinking thing, the addiction thing is harder for me to talk about than the mood disorder, which I don't really know what that's it's just the stigma of it, I guess. Embarrassment still. Also feeling like I don't want to tell secrets on my family. These are things that get talked about when we go in community and talk about these meetings. Shame, being a woman, being queer, being non-binary. I mean, all those things, they kind of all just start churning up as soon as you start talking about them. And then, but I do know that being in recovery, I do know that it has completely saved my life. I mean, I have a spiritual practice that I participate in. I have a community now. I don't know, nor do I care if my mental illness came before, picking up a drink, or if I self-medicated, or because of, I don't care. You know what I mean? It's like, this is what I have going on, and I am where I am, and I get the help that I need to help me live the most serene life that I can. I'm interested in being a part of a community and being a part of seeking solutions, not being in the problem. So that's kind of where I'm at. And I'm glad that Northeastern has this group. Again, I'm still nervous about it. I'm not a tenure track person, but I really don't believe from what I know about Northeastern right now. I mean, I can't imagine that anyone would put my job at risk because of my honesty. I would just think if that was what was going on, I wouldn't want to be here anyway. So yeah, I want to be a place where I am fully accepted, and that part of that is what is loved about me, right? And cherished and wanted. So I'm thrilled to be at Northeastern and thrilled that they make space for this. So hopefully I help somebody feel a little bit better and a little bit less alone. And again, I want to thank Tom, Kara, Chris, and Mona for inviting me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor, for sharing your journey. Now I'll open the floor to questions. Anyone can ask questions now.
Hi, my name is Chris Harmon, and I have a question for Professor Parsons and Professor Ferrick, if that's okay. So I came into this conversation not knowing exactly what the specific topics would be, and I have been formally diagnosed with OCD before, and my father is an adult child of an alcoholic, so I'm an adult grandchild of an alcoholic, if you will. So like immediately nailed me to the wall. I came into this meeting like, oh, let's, check it out. Immediately floored. So I have a question for both of you, and this specifically relates to me as I work through my OCD. Have either of y'all kind of felt like the disability isn't real enough? Sort of like, and this is not something that I don't know if this term is correct, but kind of like an imposter syndrome within the community. And that word might be too strong for what I mean, but I hope that you understand my open question about, like, have you ever had the thought where I should be able to overcome this just within my own head? This isn't real enough.
Yes. Yeah, because I know this is what when I've heard OCD specifically referred to as the doubting disease, is like one of the things it does such a good job of is telling you that you don't have it. For me, fortunately, some of the themes that picked up for me got so outlandish that I was able to say, oh yeah, that's not. I was diagnosed after a period of time where I really believed my house was going to collapse on me, and I was up all night with like levels around the house and taking pictures of cracks and like looking at them day over day. And that was when I was able to say, yeah, this isn't just, as I said, like a character flaw, like something's up here. This is not depression. But otherwise I find so much of the bleeding in day to day about that relate to, like, am I anxious about this writing because it's a deadline, or am I being obsessive compulsive? Like the boundary between the normal unhealthy behaviors and parts of higher education and what is actually pathological, I find I negotiate kind of daily. Mm-hmm. And I don't. So I think the imposter syndrome, and even right now, figuring out, like, as I said about when and where I use the term disabled, like even just saying that, I can hear a part of me saying, no, you're not. Like, you should cede the floor to people who are actually disabled.
Yes.
And yet I think
voice that's like telling you this isn't enough to be a problem, but then why can't I get past this problem in my own mind? Yeah.
Or if I was just more disciplined and meditated more and ran better, that it wouldn't be as much of an issue. Or if I just did the deadlines and just answered that email yesterday, that actually everything would be fine. Yeah, so no, 100%. But I think part of, as I said, being more open about this and joining the community is, and this is, I think, something Melissa highlighted, when you take this out of your own mind and actually bring it to a community, you start realizing that actually, like, a lot of people have these quirks, and it decensors it from yourself, and you can identify the patterns of thought more than the content and recognize that those are pathological. That's been my experience, at least. And so that's been one of the really beneficial parts of being more open about it in the university.
Mhm. Mhm.
Yeah, I'll just second that what Chris said, which is about the telling you it doesn't have it. That's always like one of the lines I hear in Al-Anon meetings, which is this is the one disease that tells you don't have a disease. It's like everything's fine. Everybody's house is like this, and then when I look back, it's like, why didn't I have anybody sleep over my house? Why was I always going to somebody else's house to sleep over? Riding in the back of an El Camino with your dog going 75 miles an hour while your parent is drinking and smoking a joint is not normal. But to me, that was normal and fun, right? I mean, it was kind of fun, but see, like that humor is only like, we get it because we get it, right? So
Right.
so much love in my home. I just also want, so much love. And my dad's been sober for 42 years now. So it's like, but that doesn't go away. And being the adult, like having a grandparent that totally 100%, I'm sure you get it. Control issues, OCD, those are all things, like if I just keep this together, then I'll be okay. But really it's like, then everybody else will be okay. Right. So it's like that caretaking thing, which makes us great at our jobs, but tired. I don't know. That's one of the things I struggle with the most when I'm mostly with the cyclothymia is I'll just get exhausted and then feel like I can't, like Chris had said, just like I feel like I just need 2 days. And then this, as you know, in this job too, I just can't do that, so thank God for summers, I guess.
Something you said, Professor Ferrick, that hit me very hard was that there's a concern about to what extent, if I'm talking about what I need, am I sharing family secrets? Am I betraying the family? So I don't know if there's any resolution to that immediately, but I just want to thank you both, because like I said, I came into this meeting and you both just nailed me to the floor and I was like, oh my God. So thank you for talking about it. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
This is more kind of a comment to go off of what Chris has said about, as well as Professor Ferrick, about disclosing secrets of families. Having been through similar situations, but also being of a faith where we're taught to hide the sins or mistakes of others as well as our own. It all boils down to intention. And what is your intention of disclosing that information? In my opinion. And I'm also going into the field of mental health. I am on a path to become a nurse practitioner as a psych nurse. So hearing these stories will help me be a better clinician also, and by understanding other people's stories and as well as my own. But I do really agree that it goes back to the intention. Are you disclosing this information because your mental health is at stake? Or are you disclosing this information to be like revengeful? So I think that the fact that from what I can see with all of us that have mentioned it, the intention is to seek help and to better ourselves. So we need to not be hard on ourselves for disclosing that information.
Yeah, it's a tricky thing, because I personally have also depending on where and how you do it in terms of like the media, the longevity of those disclosures is something that I have been like, this is something I've thought about, although I have dropped off social media for my mental health during the pandemic. But with disclosing like in public that way, that's why I have tried to opt more towards these kind of settings where I feel like I there's some trust built in. And I think this is something like Melissa was saying about knowing like that there are particular communities you can go to where there are rules about where disclosure ends, the aims of the disclosure, that sort of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why this forum feels a bit out of bounds. Like I was nervous to say yes to this just because I normally only talk about this stuff in rooms where, you know, whatever is said is left there, where they're, and you know, it is, I thought that was interesting what you shared. Thanks for your comment. Yeah, I mean, I go to my groups and do and participate in my practice so that I stay balanced and in the middle, so to speak. That's always kind of how I say it. And also so that I help other people. I mean, that's it. I have to give it away to keep it, so to speak. So I hope that's helpful.
I was a member of a group. Oh, sorry, Mona, you were going to say.
I was just going to say that I just deeply appreciate both of you sharing your stories, and I know how nerve-wracking it can be. So I don't know. Thank you.
I was going to say I was a member of a group on Facebook when I still use Facebook that was OCD manifests itself in particular types of themes, usually about like the worst thing you can imagine coming, like how people with Tourette's will often shout like awful things that they like are the opposite of what they want to say. That's kind of like, and so there's a type of OCD called harm OCD where people will be worried that they'll hurt people, but actually statistically they're like the least likely to, because actually they're policing their behavior and their thoughts all the time. But I was part of a group, for example, that got shut down because someone had disclosed about harm fears about their kids, and they were like everybody, anyone who knows anything about OCD will know that these people will not act on those. But someone tangentially related found out what they disclosed, and they lost their job, and so the group itself decided to shut down. So these things can have real ramifications. And I will just gladly point out that I've talked a lot about the process of how my mind works, but I'm still like, there are very few settings where I'll describe what my brain, what those obsessions and those compulsions are, because I still find that incredibly hard to talk about in a public setting.
Professor Carl Reed, you can go on.
I certainly don't need the title here in this group, so thank you, though. I'm the Chief Inclusion Officer here at Northeastern, and we several of my colleagues are here who help to sponsor the affinity groups, and I love the forum, the sense that this is the trust and the relationships and the understanding that's built here. And I'm learning so much, and I have dealt with a number of my own challenges in anxiety attacks over the years. And when, you know, you just can't anticipate when they came, but they came and suddenly, and as a result, they precluded me from pursuing a lot of opportunities until I was able to address it as well over about 10, 15 years ago. You both are at different stages in your comfort with sort of revealing your invisible disability, and it seems, and my question to you is, and I'm glad you are, my question to you is, what could Northeastern do better? What for not just for you, but for anyone who comes into our community and can be welcomed, so that we could accelerate the process in which we can create safe places for people to feel that they can thrive here at Northeastern across the network. And they're not just for you, but for anybody here.
I can start. Thanks, Carl, for coming. It's good to see you. You know, when I had said that thing about meetings on campus, I think that would be really nice. There was one meeting on campus, but there were like 3 people there, and nobody knew where it was, and so that would be really great. And I think I asked about this once, but I think Mona and I were just talking, and you know, it could be just a like an ally group of people who've been affected by addiction, right? So it doesn't, and I think that I know a lot of students would like to do that. I would be happy to be somebody who, fronted that if you need a faculty member to, because I think when at this stage, especially at a university, I mean, I'm an adult, so I know I can go to specific meetings for specific things, but there's a lot of different approaches now as well to, it's not just 12-step, there's other kinds of approaches that people use. I'm personally a fan of 12-step because it has a spiritual element to it, but some people aren't, right? So I think that just like an affinity group for people who have been affected by addiction in some way, shape, or forms, doesn't have to be alcohol, doesn't have to be drugs, it can be, other kinds of things too, would be good. I think that would be a good group. The other thing that comes up sometimes for me, but I think this is just something I have to deal with it all the time, is during the day when I have to go to things that are work functions and there's alcohol. That's really triggering for me. If I go somewhere at night, I expect there to be people like having a drink at a dinner, but also during COVID with faculty meetings, there were meetings I was in where people were drinking on the screen. And that was like really hard for me. It was already hard enough, I mean? All the meetings were shut down. We couldn't go in person. Everything switched to Zoom, thank God. But losing community for people like me was, I'm sure for everybody it was difficult, but I mean, people who maybe go to church like losing your spot, losing your space was a whole other level. So yeah, I don't know if there's just a way to kind of consider the beverages that you offer. It'd be nice to have more than just coffee or water. Yeah, maybe a smoothie station or something. Go all out.
For me, so there is I know there's a disability affinity group in the works that I think will be quite great. I think what I could have benefited from, a clearer, if you are having this issue, these are the people to whom you can speak early on. Because as I said, for me, the people I knew I could turn to were also the people who were going to decide my tenure case and were weighing in on a spousal hire that I was looking for and this sort of stuff. And so those were the people that I wanted to be 110% with. What I now could use, and what I think I could have used as well, was sometimes I find support and affinity is great, but the things I've benefited most from are like memoirs of academics who wrote about their experiences, like Ellen Sacks's The Center Cannot Hold, for example, or these people who've written about like concrete advice. I don't know if you know Ellen Sacks at USC. Anyway, she's written things like, make sure you time your classes with in mind for when you take your medications, so that if you're drowsy at a particular moment, like there's those sorts of concrete pieces of advice that I have benefited, or that I benefited from, and I think could more. And as I think you said that your anxiety limited you from participating in some of the things you wanted, and that's like kind of where, in some ways, I find myself, where I have dipped my toes into different types of service and that sort of stuff, but the actual process of becoming reliable in a 9-to-5 sort of way, I've worked great, where I can work my butt off for 3 weeks and get something out and then disappear for a week. But those sorts of like specific mentorship opportunities of people at different generations who've done this, I think I would benefit from.
We also have some questions in the chat. One of the question is, how freeing and scary is it to be able to be open?
Well, it's still scary right now, but I'll feel better in about an hour.
And as I said, I put really boundaries about what I'm open, but now that I have tenure and my wife has a job at Northeastern, and I don't particularly, and I'm a humanities professor. Like I'm supposed to be quirky, as I said. So I don't really care how crazy people think I am at this point.
Yeah, I would say also, like, Chris, what you just talked about, it made me think about Kate Redmond. Like I'm a professor of the practice, and I teach a 3-3, which is killing me. And it's too much. It's too much. And because of my title, I also don't have the opportunity to take a sabbatical, and I'm supposed to still be a practicing artist. And I've been trying to write and publish. That's one of the reasons I came here. And so I really need that too. I need help somehow. If there was a way that Northeastern could somehow help, I mean, not just maybe it's just this title that needs to be able to have an opportunity to take a semester where I can write for Northeast, you know what I mean? Do something for the college. Or like you had said, a 9 to 5, like I definitely work better, like 10 to 6 every day, and then know that I'm going to have a chunk of time off. I don't know. Yeah, the scheduling is interesting. Just wanted to throw that out there. Thanks, Chris.
There is also another question. How do you introduce accommodations? For example, like mental health days, sound cancellation when entering a new environment?
I haven't, I think that this, like I introduce, the only time things stay pretty invisible in that way. Like I don't necessarily have fidget toys, and I usually can, I have been able to like white knuckle it in terms of teaching and that sort of stuff. I have introduced like I just describe it as feeling unwell if I have not been able to get back into an email or something like that. So this is to Doris. Yeah, it's something that I still am figuring out about how you introduce those. But as I said, I think I come from a really privileged position as a white male professor where quirks are like marks of authority. My wife and I talk about this a lot, that like there some of the stuff that make me seem smarter and more engaged and this sort of stuff would make her seem flighty or this sort of thing. So it's not like quirks and stuff like that. I don't think I've actually had to, I haven't really had to explain. So I've gone out of my way sometimes to explain that what's happening now is actually you're seeing the obsessive part or these sorts of things. So I've tried to explain things as they're happening rather than ask for excuse.
There's a question. Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I've seen Sandra Scheffelbein has had her hand up for a while.
Yeah, Professor Sandra.
Thank you both for sharing your story. I really appreciate it. One thing that I thought was super inspiring is the community that you find with students. Can you just describe how does that happen? Do they just come to you? And how can other professors enable that kind of community to feel welcome in our classroom?
I have spent a lot of time trying to make my syllabi and those, like that first class, as accessible as possible. And I really try to go into great detail about the attendance policy, excuse policy, and this sort of stuff, and really explain that I don't go into details. I don't lie out on a couch, but I explain that I have an invisible disability and I'm incredibly sympathetic and I want people to talk to me about it. Like when I explain plagiarism, I explain that it's usually people who feel backed into a corner and they plagiarize because they have to. So to talk to me about it. So the number one takeaway I have is, if you're having issues, come to talk to me about it. And then in specific instances, that's when I have said that I have obsessive compulsive disorder, and this has been my experience, and this is what I've done. When I teach history of medicine and health humanities, and that sometimes I bring my OCD in a little bit more clearly, like we've read this last term, a memoir, The Collected Schizophrenias, which if any of you are looking for some nonfiction to read, I highly recommend it. And so in those instances, as we were talking about like how minds work and these sorts of things, I bring in my own experience. But one of the things I've really found with all of this. I know it's kind of cliche to know if like if you've met one disabled person, you've met one disabled person, is to really try to frame it as like I'm willing to listen rather than I know, and that we can work things out together. And the number one thing I've done in my classes as well is when I'm coming up with my learning objectives assignments, this is the sort of thing I've really thought about really clearly, like what is the absolute goal here, so I don't mistake the process for the goal. So if, I don't know, if students miss a bunch of preparation, there's certain things we can do that make sure that I know they've done. There's a lot of ways of getting to that goal, so that it seems less linear. And that gives me a lot more flexibility to work with students to make sure that I'm happy at the end of the term with what they've done, and they haven't destroyed themselves trying to kind of walk a particular route that I've laid out.
Thanks for asking this question. I think I also, first class, I just tell my story, you know. I don't get really specific either. I learned that the hard way. But I do say that I grew up in a home with addiction, and I have a lot of experience with living with addiction. I have a lot of cousins and uncles too, you know. And so I also do that thing where I don't say, if you want to talk to me about it, I just kind of tell them where I came from and my story, like, and it's intertwined with the touring and the music, and then the mood disorder part of it comes up more when I teach, just same as Chris, when I teach a course now it's a 6300, and it's about modes of inquiry. And a lot of it has to do with, or I lean a lot of it on, I have them all choose a biography of a luminary, and then they go through that luminary's childhood, and they walk hand in hand with a luminary through the entire semester and reflect on what parts of their process are similar to the process that this luminary had. And I use a lot of my own stories in that. But to what you're asking specifically, I can tell you that in one semester at Berkeley, I had 7 students come to me who needed to be hospitalized for either addiction or for a mental health issue. And I walked every single one of those students to the mental health center. So when I had 7 students have to be hospitalized in one semester, that's when I started talking out loud about this. And I hadn't brought this up before, but to Carl's point before, I think something else that Northeastern could help us all with, us faculty, is so the job that I have is now not only to teach with all that comes with that, but also I end up becoming someone that students really rely on emotionally. A lot of kids come to me and ask me they talk. I mean, it's just like, I should really get a counselor. I mean, I should go, I've thought about this before. I'm like, maybe I should get a license. I mean, it's just, it's exhausting. I'm sure we've all had experiences with it. These kids are really having a hard time. So, yeah, I don't know. They trust me, right? Like when you create a sense of psychological stability, safety, psychological safety, you know, this is what's going to happen. And it's a really, really important to do. I also really try to implement as much ULD as much universal learning design as I possibly can. So those are things that I do and that I still try to stay on top of with workshops throughout the year to up my pedagogies on that. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you, Professor.